Morning all. US officials have warned that Russian forces have now moved about 3 miles closer to the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, over the last 24 hours. New satellite images suggest that troops have reorganised to the northwest of Kiev, in an area where a 40-mile-long convoy had been stalled for days. Well, the pictures show armoured units moving through towns and repositioning in forest, with some artillery already in firing positions. There are also reports this morning that at least one person has been killed in airstrikes in the central city of Dnipro. All this as both the White House and Boris Johnson warn that President Putin could soon turn to chemical weapons. Well, let's take a quick look at the key developments. And the UK's Ministry of Defence says it is highly unlikely that Russia has successfully achieved the objectives it outlined in its pre-invasion plan. A US defence source says that Russia has made, moderate advances towards Kiev in the past day. Forces have moved 3 miles closer to the capital and are now just 10 from the city centre. Boris Johnson has told Sky News he thinks that Vladimir Putin may be preparing to use chemical weapons in Ukraine. And the G7 countries and the EU will reportedly move today to strip Russia of its most favoured nation trade status, which would allow them to impose tariffs on Russian goods. Sky's Sally Lockwood has our first report.
For days, a 40-mile military convoy had stalled outside Kyiv. But images taken in the last 24 hours suggest Russian troops have reorganised. US satellite company Maxar says vehicles appear to have dispersed and redeployed, with towed artillery now in firing positions nearby. It comes as a senior US defence official said Russian troops have advanced on the capital, while the information war escalates over whether a chemical weapons attack is being planned.
No chemical or any other weapons of mass destruction were developed on my land. The whole world knows that. You know that. And if you do something like that against us, you will get the most severe sanctions response.
The scenes of a bombed maternity hospital in Mariupol suggest there are no boundaries to Russia's barbarism. The concern now is a chemical attack. Russia has called a meeting of the UN Security Council later to discuss unsubstantiated claims Ukraine is housing biological weapons. But the US has warned this is a ploy by Russia to create a pretext to deploy such weapons itself. With no desire for NATO military involvement, it seems the West's warnings about red lines fall largely on deaf ears in Moscow.
There is strong evidence that we are seeing war crimes taking place, and we need to take that evidence and record that evidence. We are working to collate the evidence on the ground of what is happening to make sure that Putin and his associates are held to account for these appalling actions.
The question is how to stop this now. Ukrainians grieving their loved ones and life as they knew it. Police Sergeant Roman Rashishin buried by his wife and 3 young children to the sound of defiance song. But in some of the worst bombed areas, there's no dignity of a funeral and no way to escape this fighting. Sally Lockwood, Sky News.
Well, meanwhile, the Prime Minister has told Sky News he thinks that Russia's Vladimir Putin may be preparing to use chemical weapons in Ukraine. Here's the PM discussing that with our political editor, Beth Rigby.
Lavrov said concerns over civilian casualties were, to quote him, pathetic shrieks.
But I'm afraid that is just where they are, and that is what we're dealing with. And I'll make you one other prediction, by the way, which is that the stuff that you're hearing about chemical weapons, this is straight out of their playbook. They start saying that there are chemical weapons that have been stored by their opponents or by the Americans, and so when they themselves deploy chemical weapons, as I fear they may, they have a sort of a Maskirovka, a fake story ready to go.
You can't see a way out at the moment?
I can't see a way out that doesn't begin with the realization by the Kremlin, that they made a catastrophic mistake. I think that Vladimir Putin has himself made it very difficult to find an off-ramp. And he has, I think, driven his tanks, so to speak, down a cul-de-sac from which it will be very hard to extricate himself.
Very pleased to say that the Digital Economy Minister, Chris Philp, joins us in the studio as well. Minister, great to have you in. Let's start with that which we were hearing Beth discussing with the PM there, the risk of chemical weapons being brought in. Just to be very clear about this, does the UK or our allies have specific intelligence that Vladimir Putin is preparing to use chemical weapons, or are we extrapolating this simply from what he has been saying?
Well, clearly, I can't comment on intelligence the UK government may have received. That wouldn't be right to speak about that publicly. But we have seen in the last 24 or 48 hours what appear to be bits of disinformation published by Russian state outlets, including, in fact, the Russian embassy here in London, putting on things like Twitter information that appear to be creating a false narrative that the Ukrainians are considering using chemical weapons, which is clearly ridiculous and totally untrue. And sometimes they do that in preparation. But I hope that is not what they're contemplating. The use of chemical weapons in any theatre of war, but certainly one where there are lots of civilians, totally unacceptable. What we've seen the Russians doing in the last 2 weeks in Ukraine is totally barbaric. We saw them in the last day or two, shelling and bombing hospitals across Ukraine, including a hospital which was where young mothers were, or new mothers were giving birth to children. What they have done is totally barbaric, which is why the United Kingdom is determined, as the Prime Minister was saying, to do everything we can to try and stop them.
But in essence, if Vladimir Putin is willing to bomb a maternity ward, he's willing to do pretty much anything.
Well, as I say, I'm not going to talk about intelligence, but using chemical weapons in an area which has lots of civilians would be a barbaric thing to do. And, I would just say to Vladimir Putin and to the Russian regime, not to cross that line, not to do that to civilian populations.
Let's then talk about what we heard yesterday, that finally, eventually, Roman Abramovich has been sanctioned. I'm just wondering, I think many people are wondering this, what has changed in the week since the Prime Minister accidentally, misspoke and said that Abramovich was sanctioned when he wasn't? What have we learned in the past 7 days that has allowed us to move to this position?
Well, the United Kingdom, of course, is a country which respects the rule of law. We have to go through a proper process to make sure that everything is done in a way that's legally watertight. People like Abramovich, have expensive lawyers, and we want to make sure that we don't get challenged. So we've gone through carefully and methodically, putting together a case that is watertight. And yesterday we acted against not just Abramovich, but 6 other oligarchs who control critical Russian companies like Bank, like Rosneft, like Gazprom. These are people, oligarchs and companies who are integral to the Putin regime. They're sustaining him, they're supporting him, they're enabling him, and it's right that we act against them as part of our set of measures. Of course, we've already sanctioned over 300 Russian individuals and entities, and we've worked with other countries to exclude Russia from the SWIFT system, and that's having a big effect.
You have to accept that any oligarch, but particularly someone with the deep pockets of Roman Abramovich, will have moved assets out of the country in the days, from when it first became mooted that he would be sanctioned. You have to accept that.
Well, I mean, there are some assets that are hard to move, like Chelsea Football Club, that's not going anywhere, and the house, as far as that hasn't been sold. And of course, we've also done asset freezes against a number of big Russian banks. We have frozen the assets of about £250 billion worth of Russian bank balance sheet assets. And those were frozen a while ago. And that is more, by the way, than the European Union. It's more than the United States. So those assets have been frozen for some time now.
Well, let's talk specifically about Chelsea. I mean, first and foremost, you're not a fan, are you? I'm
a Palace fan.
OK, fair enough. Yeah, so apologies. If a suitable buyer for Chelsea was found, is the government currently minded to allow that deal to go through?
Yeah, so as the licence conditions are written today, the sale would not be allowed. However, if a buyer emerged, then it would be open to that buyer or to the football club to approach the government and ask for the licence conditions to be varied in a way that allowed that sale to take place. So they'd be able to approach the government to make a proposal. But to be clear, no proposal would be accepted which saw the money, the proceeds of any sale, ending up in an unrestricted bank account owned by Abramovich. He can't benefit from the proceeds of any sale.
Let's talk a little bit then about the Ukrainian refugee crisis, and it clearly is a crisis. Estimates originally were around about 2 million people may well be leaving the country. Those look to be doubled. The British public is going to be asked to take in refugees themselves. Just explain a little bit more about that scheme.
Well, it's worth just talking about the full spectrum of our response to the humanitarian crisis. I mean, first of all, we've donated aid valued at over £400 million to help the humanitarian crisis on the Ukrainian border. That's more than any other country in the world. And that is the response that the Ukrainian president principally asked for. And we've met that. We've done it more than any other country. Secondly, there is a route for people with family members, extended family members in the UK, to come over here. And the Home Secretary announced just yesterday that where people have family here and have a Ukrainian passport, then we're not going to require them to go and have biometric checks done, which was a bit of a bottleneck.
Sure, but just specifically on the opening of doors.
So thirdly, in addition to that, we're going to be making announcements in the very near future about a scheme for UK local authorities and indeed UK families to welcome Ukrainian refugees. We've announced that principle, and the details of how that scheme works will be laid out in the very near future.
Would you take anyone into your home? I mean, do we know of anyone in the Cabinet that has already suggested that they might be willing to open their doors?
Well, I think once the details are published in the very near future, everybody will have a look at that and see if their personal circumstances allow them to. And, you know, I'm sure the British public will look at that. And if they're able to, some people will be able to and some won't, they'll make their own decisions.
Just before we let you go, just closer to your brief, in fact, we've been hearing overnight, indeed yesterday, Facebook has made a temporary exception, as they're describing it, to those that have been affected by war, in essence allowing them on their platform to call for violence against Russia, something which Facebook would not allow in any other circumstances. Are you entirely sanguine with that?
Well, I haven't seen the details of that announcement, so I'm slightly reluctant to comment on what that proposal without having seen the details. What I do know is that the Russian government have been trying to block various social media platforms from operating in Russia as part of their disinformation campaign to try and essentially trick the Russian people. They're lying to the Russian people about what is happening, because if the Russian people realise the full extent of the atrocities being committed by Putin in their name, they would be extremely angry, and that is why Putin is trying to hide that from his own population. I
understand this is developing, but we have had a statement from Facebook's parent organisation, Meta. They say these are temporary measures designed to preserve voice and expression for people who are facing invasion. As always, we are prohibiting calls for violence against Russians outside of the narrow context of the current invasion. It's a narrow context, but again, I'm just wondering how you feel about one of the big tech giants, in essence, allowing people to call for violence against Russians in a way which we would probably not be allowed to do in the streets of the UK.
Well, I think it sounds like they're talking about specifically in Ukraine, and obviously the Ukrainian army and Ukrainian citizens have every right to defend their homeland, to defend their cities and their towns, to defend their hospitals against this aggression by Russia. And to be honest, if somebody was attacking Croydon, the place I represent, if somebody was bombing Croydon University Hospital, I tell you what, I would be in the streets defending my hospital. I'd be in the streets defending my town and my neighbours, as the Ukrainians are quite rightly doing.
Chris Philp, great to have you in the studio. Thanks for joining us.
Okay.
Well, let's take a quick look at the morning's papers. Again, one story in town. The Guardian leading with a report from the city of Mariupol. It describes conditions there as medieval after shelling from Russian forces. Chelsea FC's billionaire owner, Roman Abramovich, as we've just been discussing, well, he has now been sanctioned by the government and told that he has blood on his hands. That's the story in the Metro. Similar headline in the Eye. It says that Abramovich is among oligarchs complicit in Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Mirror calls Abramovich and Vladimir Putin blood brothers. The Sun claims that Chelsea Football Club could go bust as a result. And the Telegraph reports that the British public will be asked to offer their homes to tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees. Well, let's just take a closer look at how the situation in Ukraine stands this morning. President Zelensky says that 100,000 people have been evacuated from besieged areas in just the past 2 days. Yesterday, those included Izium and areas in and around Sumy. Well, around Kiev itself, evacuations also took place in Irpin, Bucha and Hostomel. Kiev's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, says that about 2 million people, that is half of the capital's population, they have left in recent weeks. Well, airstrikes were reported overnight in Dnipro. Emergency services say at least one person was killed. 2 other attacks near airports in the west were also reported. In Kharkiv yesterday, Russian shelling hit a building housing an experimental nuclear reactor. The Ukrainian officials said equipment there could release radiation if damaged. Meanwhile, the UN's nuclear watchdog says it's now lost all communications with Chernobyl, which is under Russian control. In the south, Ukrainian authorities say 1,300 civilians are now dead in Mariupol, which continues to come under heavy bombardment. And looking ahead to today, Russia's defence ministry has said it will observe a ceasefire and open 5 humanitarian corridors to let civilians flee Kiev, Sumy, Kharkiv, Chernihiv and Mariupol. Other ceasefires have, of course, been broken by Russian forces in recent days. Well, the Polish capital, Warsaw, is close to being overwhelmed by the number of refugees arriving from Ukraine. Let's speak now to Lisa Holland, joining us from Warsaw. Good to see you this morning. Lisa, just give us a bit of an idea, a kind of a first-person account of just how dire the refugee situation is beginning to come in Poland.
Morning, Neil. Well, yes, of course, the reality is that when you have millions of refugees crossing over the border in a very quick period of time, they, of course, have to go somewhere. They're not staying on the border, so they are heading to major cities. Now, the vast majority of the refugees have arrived in Poland, which means that the Polish capital, Warsaw, where I am this morning, is, of course, really at the sharp end of all of those arrivals. We've worked out that something like 15% of the previous population of Warsaw has now arrived again in terms of the numbers of refugees. So where do they all go? We've been at the central train station, which is a fairly frantic, chaotic scene of humanity. People figuring out what to do, where to go. They're tired, hungry, getting off trains. So in the very emergency initial phase, they'll be greeted by people giving them water, food, medicine supplies, even a toothbrush. And then after that, of course, they are then having to work out, should they try to stay in Poland? And in fact, one family that we spoke to told us quite candidly that, number one, they'd quite like to go to the UK, but they have no family ties. So as of this minute, they're not eligible. But also, they can see around them the pressure on the Polish authorities. And they're saying, look, we can see how busy it is here, so we want to move on to somewhere else, such as Germany. We saw a lot of people queuing for a bus to Germany, but they didn't even know what time it would go, or even what city they would end up in. And one thing they do know, though, is that they want to get away from Ukraine. But I think what is significantly different here compared to other previous migration situations is that people don't want to permanently get away from Ukraine. Of course, almost all the people that we saw yesterday were women and children, so they have left husbands, relatives, brothers, fathers back in Ukraine, and eventually they do want to go back. But right now, there is this emergency situation to provide them, people here in Warsaw, with beds, with a roof over their head and some kind of shelter, food, and just keep them going whilst events continue on the ground in Ukraine. Lisa, many thanks. Plenty more still to come on the show. In just under an hour, I'll be speaking to Labour's Shadow International Trade Secretary, Nick Thomas-Simmons. I'll also be speaking with the former head of the British Army's Chemical Weapons Unit, as the West is warning of the potential for biological and chemical warfare in Ukraine. And I'm going to be joined by a student from Glasgow going the extra mile by driving an ambulance to the Poland-Ukrainian border to help refugees fleeing the conflict. Chelsea fans turned out in strength last night, supporting both the men's and women's teams. But the future of the club is in question. Russian billionaire owner Roman Abramovich has had his assets frozen by the UK government in response to the invasion of Ukraine. Our sports correspondent Tom Parmenter has been taking a look.
The Abramovich era delivered every piece of silverware to Chelsea. But the British government say his close relationship with Vladimir Putin means they've locked down his UK assets. He'd already put Chelsea up for sale, but the sanctions mean that if a new buyer is found and approved, Abramovich won't receive a penny. Every employee has questions. Both the men's and women's sides played and won last night.
I know from my end, you know, I'm a leader of this team and we're going to have to navigate a difficult period and one where I don't have all the answers for it.
Season ticket holders will still be able to watch games, but the club can't sell any more tickets. There'll be a transfer ban and they're blocked from negotiating new contracts. The club can't sell merchandise and mobile phone firm 3 have already suspended their sponsorship. And travel costs to away games will have to be more modest. Longer trips abroad might prove more difficult. Fans at the women's match last night were still taking it all in.
We always support Chelsea, doesn't matter what situation is going on, so nothing changes that.
I've got, you know, much more concern for what's going on out in Ukraine than how he's feeling, to be honest.
At Norwich City, Thomas Tuchel's Chelsea side, the current European champions, were also taking sanctuary in just playing football.
There was a lot of distraction, another level of distraction actually with the sanctions. And we could feel it, that the players talk about it, that they're aware of it, and we accepted it.
Playing and winning football matches is something of a welcome distraction for everyone connected to Chelsea Football Club right now. The Roman Abramovich era has ended in the most extraordinary way, his links to the Kremlin overriding everything.
And still last night, they chanted his name. Football does have a habit of turning a blind eye if the money and goals are flowing. But in the space of just a few weeks, the world has changed. Tom Parmenter, Sky News, Norwich.
Some other news for you now, and as we were just discussing with the Minister, Meta platforms are allowing Facebook and Instagram users in some countries to call for violence against Russians and Russian soldiers, of course, in relation to the invasion taking place in Ukraine. The social media company is making temporary changes to its hate speech policy that will allow some posts that call for the death of Vladimir Putin or the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. The UN's nuclear watchdog says that Ukraine has lost all communications with facilities at the Chernobyl nuclear plant. It comes a day after the plant lost all external power supplies. On the site of an enormous nuclear accident in 1986, it's currently controlled by Russian forces. The Russian Defence Ministry says it will declare a ceasefire today and open humanitarian corridors from 5 Ukrainian cities for fleeing citizens, all according to Russian media. It comes after civilians were blocked from leaving the port city of Mariupol yesterday, after Russian forces refused to honour the ceasefire. Now, the government will ask people to open their homes to Ukrainians fleeing the war amidst continuing criticism of its response so far to the refugee crisis. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to the Technology Minister, Chris Philp, about what more the government was planning on doing to help.
We're going to be making announcements in the very near future about a scheme for UK local authorities and indeed UK families to welcome Ukrainian refugees. We've announced that principle, and the details of how that scheme works will be laid out in the very near future.
Would you take anyone into your home? I mean, do we know of anyone in the Cabinet that has already suggested that they might be willing to open their doors?
Well, I think once the details are published in the very near future, everybody will have a look at that and see if their personal circumstances allow them to. And, you know, I'm sure the British public will look at that, and if they're able to, some people will be able to and some won't, they'll make their own decisions.
Interesting initiative. Let's discuss with our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen. Good to see you this morning, TC. What do we make of this? I mean, clearly, some people are being briefed about this being a plan. The Minister this morning suggesting that we might have to wait a little bit for detail. that seems to be happening quite regularly with this government.
So there is going to be a new scheme announced on Monday, a humanitarian scheme for Ukrainians who don't have a family connection here in the UK. Those people are allowed to come already. This is for people who would be sponsored by organisations like local councils or charities or churches who can put them up somewhere. But the reason that this has been delayed is because a lot of detail needs to be worked out, and that's being done by Michael Gove's Levelling Up department as to exactly what they would need to provide, how long would some of these organisations need to put up Ukrainian refugees for. And, of course, part of this is going to be the role of ordinary families who maybe have a spare room and would like to offer it up. But, of course, wonderful as that sounds, there's got to be some checks and balances there. It's been stressed to me by people in government this morning that not only do you need to check Ukrainians coming into the UK, but also you need to vet the people who host them as well to make sure that they are criminal records checked. And so exactly how this is going to work, and crucially what sort of benefits Ukrainians coming to the UK might be entitled to if they are treated as refugees, even if they are not coming direct from Ukraine, they would be entitled to the right to work and all kinds of benefits, but otherwise they may not be entitled to all of it. So all this is being worked out at the moment as we speak, but we understand what the government are looking at is a minimum 3 or 6 month commitment for someone offering to host.
Well, more to discuss when we hear from it, but for now, thanks very much. Now, Western leaders are anticipating that Russia is planning to deploy biological and chemical weapons in Ukraine as a means to accomplish their objectives. Well, let's speak now to Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, former head of the British Army's Chemical Weapons Unit. Hamish, always good to have you on the channel. Before we delve into what may well happen in Ukraine, for those who are not as au fait with the rules as you, what are the rules that govern whether or not a country can use chemical or biological weapons?
Well, number one, you can't. Chemical and biological weapons have been illegal really since the time of the Geneva Convention was first conceived back in the 1920s. There are a number of other conventions like the Chemical Weapons Convention signed in 1996 by most countries around the world, including Russia, that outlaws the use of chemical weapons. Biological weapons is a slightly different area. There is the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, which outlaws them. But the basic premise that these are absolutely horrendous weapons, indiscriminate, mainly affect civilians, because, of course, soldiers tend to have gas masks and other protection. So they are illegal and horrendous under every law that one can conceive.
What is their utility, then, for someone like Vladimir Putin? Of course, there's certainly plenty of evidence that they have been deployed in his name before. What is their utility when it comes to a combat, the types of combat that we are seeing in Ukraine at the moment, which is an awful lot of street-to-street, house-to-house?
Well, I tend to agree with a lot of other commentators about what's been called the Russian playbook in Syria. I've seen the Russians at very close quarters over the last 6 years in Syria. And unfortunately, chemical weapons, what I've learned from my Syrian experience, chemical weapons are morbidly brilliant, and you'd use them all the time if you had no morals or scruples. Because in Syria, the towns and cities that were attacked, very similar to what we're seeing in Ukraine with Kyiv and other cities, once these cities are razed to the ground, the buildings have fallen down, it's almost impossible for attackers to get a foothold. And the Russians know all about this from Stalingrad in the Second World War. Over 1 million Red Army soldiers died defending Stalingrad. But what happened in Syria is after the 4-year conventional battle for Aleppo in northwest Syria, in December 2016, on 13 days, Assad dropped chlorine barrel bombs and broke that siege. Because the chlorine seeps underground, because it's heavier than air, and people hide in the rubble and underground. And the chlorine either kills them underground or forces them above ground to be shot or captured. And that also worked for Assad in a suburb called Ghouta and a suburb called Douma in 2017 and 2018. So they can be very, very successful. And unfortunately, of course, in August 2013, we had a massive sarin attack in Damascus, and the British government voted in September 2013 not to punish Assad, and the Americans followed suit. And I think that is really underwriting why we are here now, because that failure to punish Assad gave a green light to every dictator despot, rogue state and terror group to use them. And I think Putin thinks he can use them with impunity.
Yeah, difficult to disagree with that part of your analysis, Hamish. So what then should we be doing? What then can we do, if anything? Is it just a case of waiting for the inevitable to happen and preparing the case for the ICC?
Well, it's really difficult. And I know that people are terribly concerned about us and NATO getting overcommitted in Ukraine. However, again, I'd point out the Syrian experience. When we eventually attacked Assad's key sites after the nerve agent attack in a place called Khan Shaykhun in April 2017, and then we attacked again in 2018 his sites, the chemical weapons stopped. Assad knew if he used them, he was going to get thumped. We must ensure that Putin understands the consequences of his actions and perhaps enable even more the Ukrainian Air Force and military to be able to attack some of his strategic bits of equipment and strategic sites with more equipment. And I personally think we should be giving the Ukrainian army more aircraft so that they can win the battle in the skies.
Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, great to have you on the show this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Well, there are reports this morning that Russian forces are moving closer to Ukraine's capital, Kiev. Doctors and nurses in and around the capital are now running a frontline medical facility given over entirely to treating wounded Ukrainian soldiers. Our special correspondent Alex Crawford reports now from the edge of Kiev.
They arrive stuffed into car boots and on the back seats. They're taking some terrible hits trying to stop the Russian troops entering the Ukrainian capital, laid out on already blood-soaked stretchers. The soldiers have just been shelled on a front line which is creeping ever closer to Kyiv. And it's the nearest hospital, now entirely turned over to dealing with the war wounded. These aren't army medics, they're the town's doctors and nurses who 2 weeks ago were dealing with births and bone breaks. Now they're plunged into a new world, spent trying to save the lives of soldiers and civilians torn apart by bombs and bullets.
It's the World War III.
It's World War III.
It's World War III, and it could be stopped here, or it could move through all the world. Please help us to stop this war.
They are shell-shocked and shaking, and so far the politicians' peace talks have got nowhere. Hospitals are protected locations under international law, but no one here trusts that to be observed. Yet there's an astonishing resilience and perhaps a realization they have no option. It's not difficult for us to fight, he tells us. We're defending our land and will continue to protect it. But then he delivers a rousing call, not just to his fellow Ukrainian men and women, but also the rest of the world. Everyone has to stand together, he says. Glory to Ukraine, our army will win. This is on the northwest edge of the capital, and we found multiple vehicles and homes which had been hit, apparently indiscriminately. There seems to be no shortage of lucky escapes. He was on duty as an emergency worker. So you just live close by?
His house 5 houses from here.
There are thousands of lives abruptly halted by this war. Pets abandoned in the rush to keep out of the way of the rockets and bombs. Families who've upped and left everything just to try to survive. There's a constant sound of artillery and shelling going on, and you can see the devastation that some of the attacks have already had. We know, according to the locals here, that the Russians are only a few kilometers down the road, and this is the constant backdrop. So those who can't or won't leave live in a shadowy underground world below the booming war sounds. About half of the capital's population has fled the city, according to the mayor.
It smells good. Smells good.
We're just waiting for victory, for everything to be good again, she says, and trying not to cry. These are the bravest of women, tending to some of the community's most vulnerable and most frightened. We've already learnt how to tell the difference between our side's shooting and the enemy's, Natalia tells us. We can identify everything, and we're just trying to keep everyone calm. They're already living under siege here, with sons and partners fighting and their homes bombed. For sure, this is a crime, and Putin has to be punished, she tells us. They're engaged in the fight of their lives to stop the Russian troops advancing any further. But their president's warning, much more of their blood will be spilt unless his nation gets international military support. Alex Crawford, Sky News, on the edge of the capital, Kyiv.
Well, the war in Ukraine has created the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. My next guest, well, is planning on heading to the Ukraine-Poland border in an ambulance that he and his family have bought to help those injured as they flee the war zone. Very pleased to say that Umran Ali Javid joins us now on the programme. Umran, great to see you this morning. And as I understand it, you're a student at Glasgow Caledonian University.
Good to see you as well. Yeah, I'm a student studying international tourism and event management at Glasgow Caledonian University.
Good wee university, that. My little brother went there, and it's also producing someone like you. So tell us the thought behind all of this. Buying an ambulance and driving it all the way to the Ukrainian border. What prompted this?
Well, it's heartbreaking to see the images and videos that are coming out of Ukraine. So I wanted to do something to help them. And I know that these ambulances, they've got distinct markings and, a distinct colour, so they can help evacuate innocent civilians and people with disabilities through evacuation routes. And hopefully that's what it's going to do, because it's going to be handed over to a Ukrainian charity to do that.
So when are you setting off, Umran? I mean, it's not an easy drive at the best of times, but given that, the place that you're heading to is essentially on the edge of a war zone, might make it even more problematic a journey.
Yeah. Basically, I've got a class at university at 2 p.m. and I finish at 4 p.m. After class, I'm going straight to the border to England, getting a ferry to the Netherlands, then into Germany and then into Poland, and then at the Ukrainian border is where they're meeting me and the charity to take responsibility of the ambulance. So it's not really a big deal, to be honest. I've done it many times. I've took many ambulances before. So I should be there by Monday.
Tell us then, Imran, just a little bit about that. I noticed that this is not the first time that you've done this. You've taken ambulances to Burma, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, places like that. This has been something you've been doing for quite some time.
Yeah, I've been doing it for a few years now. The first time I went to the Gaza Strip with medical supplies and I seen a couple of ambulances get through. So I thought this is like a really great idea to get to take ambulances where they're needed. And second-hand British ambulances are really, really good that way to help patients get to the hospitals or where they're needed at medical centres. And it's just like heartbreaking to see. Whenever I go to Burma or these places, it's heartbreaking just to see what's going on there.
We're just looking at pictures of a apparently very peaceful and tranquil Kiev. We wonder how long that will last for. But just tell us, Umran, how have you paid for this? Because the last time my days as a student are very much in the dim and distant past. But I certainly didn't have $2.5 grand sitting in my bank account to go off and buy an ambulance.
Yeah. So 2 days ago, I went to there's a retail shop here that takes second-hand equipment. So I sold one of my graphics cards and I got £775 for that. It's like they're not in demand. They're in demand these days, and that will pay for my fuel costs and stuff. And I had some savings left over. I do like to save my money, but, just seeing what's going on, I'm just trying to help in any way I can. And I think everyone's trying to do that, help. Like, there's a lot of people in the community that are trying to help in their own way by donating money. I'm able to donate an ambulance, and I know that it could make a difference, maybe to a few hundred people. But it's not much of a difference because tens of thousands of people need help. But at least it'll make some difference.
Umran, Well done, mate. Very good on you. Drive safely, and I hope you make it back in time. I'm told you've got classes on Tuesday you've got to be back for. Yeah.
So hopefully I'll be back on Tuesday to be back in time for my class. And if I'm late, the university hopefully will be easy on me.
I was going to say, if you need someone to write a letter, Imran, I'm willing. I'm putting my name forward. Just give me a shout. Drive safely, and well, look, we'll maybe speak to you when you get back. Imran Ali Javid. Welcome back. Just a little bit of breaking news to bring you. The Russian steelmaker Evraz has said that 10 members of its board have quit following the British sanction of their largest shareholder, Roman Abramovich, and the suspension of its shares. Only the chief executive of Evraz remains on its board. We'll have a look at that and bring you more on that as and when we get it. About UK families, well, as we've been reporting, they will be asked to open their homes to Ukrainian refugees, with the government set to outline next week a sponsored humanitarian route. It comes after the government has faced growing criticism over their visa scheme for people fleeing Ukraine. One person who knows a thing or two about the struggles of bypassing the visa restrictions, Tanya Birch, joins us on the programme. Tanya, lovely to see you this morning. And just to kind of give our viewers just a little bit of context, you're Ukrainian yourself. You've been living here for 25 years, but your family, of course, have had some issues. Just tell us about those.
Well, I came to UK 25 years ago, and I'm, Ukrainian, and I'm a British citizen as well. When the war broke out, well, before the war broke out, I was begging my entire family to just go at least to Poland. They refused. They were withdrawing cash. They were planning to stay and support the refugees. So when the war broke out, my sister, I think it was on the 10th day, and her grandchildren, they decided to be, to allow themselves to be evacuated to Poland. Mm-hmm. It took them 24 hours from Lviv to reach Wrocław, which they could have been really in Australia by then. Tremendously difficult time crossing the border, standing in the freezing, in very cold weathers at night, traveling 24 hours. So when they reached Wrocław, I was delighted and booked a flight to Wrocław in hope that once we have applied for Ukrainian family scheme, I will be able to go and collect them. Yeah. Because they are entitled. She's my sister. She's entitled to come to the United Kingdom. We've got accommodation. We've got, finances. We've got so many friends and family waiting to love on her and her grandkids. Yeah. However, when I flew in, I just kept going on the website that was provided, and I could not secure an appointment for the biometrics.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're really pushed for time. What is the current status then? What is her current visa status?
She's still waiting. I flew back from Poland, unfortunately, without her and the kids yesterday, and she's still waiting for the visa.
Oh dear! How are you and how is she doing?
Well, she's happy she's in safety. However, it was just heartbreaking to, hug her goodbye and the kids. And, they were clinging because they are just hanging in the limbo. They don't know how long it's going to take for them to get this visa.
What hope do you have that your family might be joining you in the United Kingdom anytime soon?
It is, good to know that they don't have to wait for, days, weeks or months for this biometrics appointment. However, we don't know when the visa is going to be issued. We still don't know any dates, and the helplines couldn't give me any times of when the visa would be issued. So even though it is slightly better news, it's still challenging. We're just literally waiting for this visa to arrive.
Tatiana, we will keep our fingers crossed that you, your sister, the rest of your family will be reunited very, very soon. We'll keep in touch and hopefully speak again. For now, though, thanks very much.
Thank you.